We had finally moved into what we believed was our dream home, a spacious, charming old house sitting on the very edge of town, where the hum of daily life faded into tranquil fields and the soft rustling of ancient trees. It was early spring and the air smelled of freshly tilled earth and new beginnings. The sun poured through the large, old-fashioned windows in lazy beams, warming the polished hardwood floors and freshly painted walls. The house had a certain timeless elegance with its broad porch, weathered shutters, and ivy curling up the brick chimney. It was a house full of promise, the kind that whispered of family dinners, quiet evenings by the fire, and lazy Sunday mornings. The previous owners had clearly cared for it deeply, but there was something about it that hinted at stories beneath the surface, tales held tightly behind closed doors and beneath the floorboards. Moving day was a whirlwind of boxes, laughter, and the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into your bones. Yet despite the chaos, there was an undeniable excitement in the air. My partner and I unpacked late into the evening, arranging furniture, choosing the perfect spot for photographs, and exploring every nook and cranny with bright eyes. That first night, the house seemed to breathe around us, the old wooden frame settling with soft creaks and sighs, a symphony of comforting sounds to those who had grown up with old houses. We fell asleep easily, wrapped in warm blankets, lulled by the steady rhythm of life settling in. But then, deep into the night, everything changed. At precisely 3 a.m., I awoke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing just outside our bedroom door, echoing softly on the hardwood floor. I lay still for a moment, heart hammering, convinced it was my partner waking for some unknown reason. "Hey, are you up?" I whispered. No answer. The footsteps continued, slow, steady, back and forth, as if someone was walking a deliberate path, trapped in a private ritual. My breath hitched in my throat. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and pushed the door open, shining the beam into the dark hallway. Empty. The silence that followed was suffocating. No signs of movement, no shadows. The cats, who had been sleeping at the foot of the bed, lifted their heads, but showed no signs of alarm. I returned to bed, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep was elusive, and I lay awake, listening for sounds that never came. But the footsteps haunted me in the dark, etched into my mind with an uneasy persistence. The next morning, I told my partner about the experience. He smiled, suggesting it was probably just the house settling or a nervous reaction after the move. But that night, the footsteps returned, accompanied by other strange occurrences. Doors I was certain I had locked were found wide open. Lights flickered erratically despite the new electrical wiring installed only weeks before. Occasionally, I caught out of the corner of my eye a flicker of shadow moving too fluidly to be a trick of the light, vanishing instantly when I turned to look. Even the cats grew uneasy. They refused to enter certain rooms, their backs arched and tails puffed, as if sensing an invisible intruder. One evening, as a gray storm rolled in and rain tapped lightly against the windows, the whispers began. At first, it was nothing more than a faint murmur, like the rustle of dry leaves or wind threading through the cracks. But as the night deepened, the sound grew clearer. Soft, breathy whispers emanating from the walls themselves, just beyond comprehension. The words were unintelligible, a strange, fragmented language that raised goosebumps on my skin. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, desperate to understand. The whispers coiled around my thoughts, twisting my mind in knots of fear and fascination. My partner, when I told him, laughed nervously, but I saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. Unable to bear the growing unease, we decided to call a paranormal investigator, someone with experience in haunted places and the unseen realms. The woman who arrived was calm, collected, with a kind but serious demeanor. She carried an arsenal of devices, EMF meters, infrared cameras, and audio recorders, ready to uncover the invisible. She spent hours walking through every room, speaking softly about energy residues, hauntings, and spiritual imprints. She asked questions about the house's history, the land it was built on, and the previous owners. When she examined the floor in the hallway where I had first heard the footsteps, she paused. Her fingers traced an almost imperceptible seam in the floorboards beneath a faded rug. With quiet precision, she pried open a hidden panel to reveal a narrow crawl space, long sealed and untouched by time. Inside, the air was stale and heavy with dust. There were old belongings stacked carefully, a worn leather satchel, rusted keys, a bundle of faded letters tied with a brittle ribbon, and most strikingly, a weathered diary bound in cracked leather. As I leafed through the fragile pages, I found the name Thomas Greaves scrawled in fading ink. The diary revealed the man's secret existence beneath the house, a life of solitude and fear, spent hidden away from the world in this cramped space beneath the floor. Thomas's words told of a man who had chosen to disappear, living in the shadows of the home above, watching the comings and goings of the family without ever revealing himself. His entries spoke of paranoia and loneliness, of the crushing weight of isolation. But as I read further, his tone grew darker and more fragmented. He wrote of whispers from the walls, voices that spoke to him in the dead of night, offering companionship but also binding him in invisible chains. The final pages were scrawled hastily, filled with desperate pleas for release and warnings not to disturb what lay beneath. The last sentence ended abruptly, as if his pen had been torn from his hand. We resealed the crawl space, but the house felt forever changed. The footsteps never stopped, the shadows never fully disappeared, and the whispers grew louder on cold, windless nights. I often lie awake wondering if Thomas Greaves still walks the halls, an unseen tenant trapped between worlds, forever watching, forever pacing. Intrigued and disturbed, I dug deeper into the house's history and discovered that Thomas Greaves had once been a laborer in the town during the early 1000s. 900s. He was known as a quiet, solitary man who had gradually become a recluse. Local legends spoke of a man who had disappeared without a trace, his family and friends presumed dead or vanished. Records indicated that the house had undergone several renovations and expansions in the decades since Thomas's disappearance. It was rumored that parts of the original foundation had been sealed off to cover structural damage, but no one ever suspected the crawl space was a secret refuge. As I read more about Thomas, I began to understand the crushing despair that had consumed him. His isolation had twisted his mind until he could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. The diary described nights when shadows took shape, when walls whispered promises and threats, and when Thomas believed he was losing himself to an invisible presence that lived within the house. It was almost as if the house itself had claimed him. Life in the house has become a constant battle against the unseen. I keep the lights on as long as possible, draw heavy curtains to shut out the night, and try to keep the atmosphere light and busy, but the house rebels. Doors creak open on their own, lights flicker at odd intervals, and the whispers crawl through the walls like a persistent, malevolent breath. Sometimes, when I sit quietly in the living room, I feel eyes on me, cold, watchful, unblinking. The cats refuse to enter the hallway after sunset, their low growls and wide eyes a warning I cannot ignore. Despite all this, I'm terrified to leave the house. It has its claws in me now, a cold, invisible tether that holds me to the past and to Thomas Greaves' restless spirit. I wonder if the house will ever release us, or if we are doomed to be its prisoners, living alongside a tenant who was never meant to be seen. When we first bought the house, it was very much a fixer-upper. An old Victorian-style home with faded paint, creaky floors, and the unmistakable scent of neglect and time left unchecked. The previous owner had clearly left in a hurry. The place still had boxes of abandoned belongings, outdated furniture covered with sheets, and layers of grime, thick enough to dull the sun's rays streaming through the stained glass windows. One of the most striking things was the wallpaper. It covered almost every wall in the house, a faded, peeling patchwork of florals and patterns that seemed to whisper of decades long gone. Some rooms had more than one layer, yellowed paper beneath torn layers of other wallpaper, stuck stubbornly to the plaster, like remnants of forgotten memories. One mild spring evening, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming lilacs outside, I decided to tackle the living room wallpaper. The walls were a patchwork of faded roses and curling vines, but near the corner by the fireplace, the paper had begun to bubble and crack, curling at the edges. I figured peeling it back would be a good first step toward restoring the room's dignity. Armed with a scraper and a bucket of warm water mixed with vinegar, I set to work, carefully easing the brittle paper from the wall. At first it came off in large strips, dusty and torn, but then something strange caught my eye beneath the surface. A pattern of dark, twisted symbols scrawled directly on the plaster beneath the wallpaper. At first, I thought it was some kind of graffiti or old ritual marking, but the color was unsettling, a deep, rusty red that looked disturbingly like dried blood, smeared and scrawled with shaky, urgent strokes. The symbols were unfamiliar, almost runic, twisting into shapes that felt both ancient and malevolent. A cold shiver ran down my spine, but I told myself it was probably just some strange prank by the previous owner or the work of local kids. I washed my hands and tried to shake the creeping unease. That night, sleep eluded me. The house felt suffocating, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, as if the house was breathing with a slow, terrible pulse. Then came the scratching noises. Faint at first, like nails dragged lightly across plaster or wood, but growing louder, more insistent. It was as if something was trapped inside the walls, clawing at the barrier that held it back. Over the next few weeks, the scratching became a nightly ritual, always beginning around the same time, exactly 2:22 a.m. I set alarms, convinced I was losing my mind, but each time, at that precise minute, the wallpaper in the living room would peel back slightly, curling away from the wall to reveal more of those dark symbols beneath. Sometimes I thought I heard whispering carried faintly on the stale air, indecipherable but chilling. I tried everything, taping the wallpaper back down, covering the exposed plaster with fresh paint, even consulting old city records to see if there had ever been anything strange associated with the house or the land. The records were sparse. The previous owner was a reclusive man who'd lived there alone and left without warning, leaving the house abandoned for nearly a year. Neighbors whispered about strange lights seen through the windows at night, fleeting shadows crossing the yard, and the occasional sound of crying or laughter echoing eerily in the stillness. One night, the nightmare crossed the threshold of sleep. I woke abruptly, the room bathed in pale moonlight filtering through the curtains. At the foot of my bed stood a figure, pale and almost translucent, with hollow eyes that bore into me with a chilling emptiness. Its presence was suffocating, silent, but overwhelming. I froze, heart hammering, unable to tear my gaze away from those eyes that seemed to stare through me, as if seeing into places I had never dared to explore. Time seemed to stretch and twist, the air thick with cold and fear. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure faded into the shadows, leaving a silence so deep it roared in my ears. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By dawn, I had packed a bag, every instinct screamed to leave, to run from the cursed house that no longer felt like home. I didn't look back. The house still stands, empty now, its windows like dark eyes watching the street, its walls harboring secrets too terrible to face. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the wallpaper peeling back on its own, revealing those cursed symbols, and the pale figure pacing silently behind them, waiting for the next tenant to uncover what should have remained hidden. Shortly after moving into my new house, nestled on a quiet street in a sleepy suburb, I was eager to start fresh. The neighborhood was charming, rows of modest homes with white picket fences, flowering gardens, and tree-lined sidewalks where children played and neighbors greeted each other with warm smiles. Everything felt safe, familiar, and promising. The house itself was an old two-story colonial with weathered clapboards and creaky wooden floors, but I liked the character it had. A fixer-upper certainly, but it had good bones and plenty of space. The previous owner had left in a hurry, leaving behind a few dusty boxes and an unsettling silence. One afternoon, as I was unpacking kitchenware and arranging books on shelves, a soft knock came at the door. Opening it, I was met by an elderly woman, her back slightly hunched, her face lined with decades of sun and worry, but her eyes bright and piercing. "I'm Mrs. Ellery," she said with a cautious smile. "I live a few houses down. I just wanted to welcome you and warn you." I invited her in out of politeness. She settled into the living room, clutching a worn handbag. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "This neighborhood has its stories. The house you've bought, well, it sits over something old. Something better left alone." Curious, I urged her to explain. "Beneath your house is what we call the burial ground, a small, forgotten cemetery from before this town existed. The houses were built over it years ago, but the ones buried there, they don't rest easy." "Not truly." I smiled, uncomfortable with her ominous tone. That sounds like a ghost story. I've lived here all my life. No one's ever mentioned anything like that. Mrs. Ellery's eyes darkened. Maybe that's for the best, but you do well to stay out of the house after dark. The ones beneath, they stir, and they don't take kindly to visitors. I laughed it off. An old woman's superstition, surely, but something about the way she said it stuck in my mind. That first night, I went to bed early, the soft hum of the ceiling fan my only companion. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a faint noise. Tapping, rhythmic, deliberate. It came from the basement door, low at the foot of the hallway. I lay still, heart pounding. The tapping continued, slow, patient, insistent. Not the wind, not pipes. Someone or something was knocking. I forced myself out of bed, grabbing my phone for light, and tiptoed to the basement door. The wooden door was old, its paint peeling. When I reached out, my fingers trembled. Opening the door revealed nothing but thick darkness. I shone my phone's flashlight down the narrow staircase, illuminating the cracked plaster walls. Fresh scratches gouged the surface, long, deep, jagged, like claws desperately trying to claw their way out. The air smelled damp, earthy, and something more metallic, like old blood. A shiver ran down my spine. I slammed the door and bolted it, locking it with trembling hands. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Animals, pranksters, maybe even my imagination. But that night, the knocking returned. Louder, more urgent, now accompanied by faint whispers. They called my name, barely audible, carried on the thick darkness like a sinister lullaby. Sleep abandoned me entirely. Over the next week, the phenomena escalated. The basement door rattled violently as if something was trying to break free. I found strange symbols scratched into the walls near the basement, circles, crosses, patterns I couldn't understand. I reached out again to Mrs. Ellery. Her face was grave. "They've been disturbed," she said softly. "The burial ground, disturbing their resting place, awakens them. They want to be remembered. They want justice. They want vengeance." She pressed an old, faded photo into my hand. A sepia-toned image of a group of settlers, their faces stern, standing near a clearing marked as a cemetery. Among them, a man stared straight into the camera with dark, unblinking eyes that sent a chill through me. "I don't know what they want from you," she said, voice trembling, "but you need to leave before it's too late." That night, the pounding on the basement door became a relentless, thunderous assault. The whispers turned into low growls, twisting into desperate cries. In the darkness, I swore I saw pale hands reach from the cracks around the doorframe, grasping, clawing at the threshold between this world and whatever lay beneath. I didn't wait for dawn. I packed my essentials in the cold, early morning light, my skin crawling with dread. As I locked the front door for the last time, a heavy silence fell over the street. Mrs. Ellery watched from her porch, eyes full of warning and sadness. "The ones beneath, don't forget," she whispered. I left the house and the neighborhood behind, but sometimes in the stillness of the night, I swear I still hear the faint tapping of those restless ones, echoing from the shadows beneath. If the creeping dread of the unseen tenant, the cursed whispers of the cursed wallpaper, and the restless fury of the neighbor's warning left you double-checking every shadow in your home, welcome to the dark heart of new beginnings, where fresh paint hides ancient scars, floorboards groan with buried secrets, and the walls themselves breathe. Before you settle into your next chapter, shatter that like button if these tales made your new house feel anything but home. Share this video with anyone brave enough to unlock a haunted door, and subscribe to unearth the horrors lurking behind every fixer-upper. Every click is a flicker in the dark, a vow that the next nightmare is already keys in hand waiting to move in. Now the question whispers, have you felt it too? The cold breath of a presence in an empty room, the scrape of claws behind freshly painted walls. Maybe you've glimpsed symbols bleeding through wallpaper, heard knocks from a basement that shouldn't exist, or met a neighbor with warnings too dire to ignore. Whether it's a diary bound in despair, a figure at the foot of your bed, or a burial ground stirring beneath your floor, we want to hear it. Confess your story in the comments, or send it sealed in silence. Your nightmare could be the key to the next locked door, or the final piece of a curse older than the foundation itself. To those already haunted by four walls and a roof, ring the bell to ensure you never miss a descent into the attic of the unknown. Follow us into the static between floorboards on social media, where we dissect cursed blueprints, decode spectral evictions, and dare to ask what ancient grudge lives in your lease. Peek into the description for links, eerie property records, and a map to the voids behind the drywall. If you dare to pry, as the last light fades and the house settles into silence, remember this: a home is not a sanctuary. It's a seance. The unseen tenant. The wallpaper's curse. The graves beneath the porch. They've always been here. Waiting. Patient. Hungry. The line between move-in ready and never leave is as thin as a skeleton key. And in the dark, it turns. So lock your doors, ignore the taps, and if the walls start to whisper, run. The house remembers its ghosts, and you're just the latest tenant. Until next time, homeowners and haunters, may your foundations stay solid, your basements stay sealed, and your shadows stay still.